stepped in late, wrapped in scarlet red, with the whole world seeming to spin around her. He knew his life would never be the same again. A billionaire used to controlling everything. A woman carrying invisible scars in her chest. A red dress. A look that pierced straight through his soul. And the certainty that some encounters don't happen by chance. They happen to transform us. Henry Callahan never felt comfortable at ceremonies. No matter how many times he attended gala events, lavish weddings, or business dinners, there was always that feeling of being out of place, as if he were watching life through a foggy window. He was the man who built empires of concrete and steel, who transformed abandoned lots into gleaming skyscrapers. But when it came to genuine human connections, he felt like a stranger in unfamiliar territory. On that sunny Saturday afternoon, Henry sat in the third row at his best friend David's wedding ceremony. The venue was stunning. A glass ceiling allowing natural light to flood the space, white and green flowers hanging from elegant structures, the soft sound of a string quartet filling the air with delicate melodies. Everything seemed perfect, meticulously planned. He adjusted the knot of his Italian tie, watching the guests around him chatting animatedly, laughing, sharing stories. But Henry was silent. His gaze swept across the room with that cold analysis he'd developed over the years, calculating, measuring, keeping his distance. He noticed the venue's architecture, the way the wooden beams supported the ceiling, the impeccable acoustics, everything except the emotions pulsing around him. Then the double doors of the hall opened, and Henry's world stopped. Millionaire Wright entered with the rush of someone who knew she was late, but with the grace of someone who wouldn't let that diminish her. She wore a scarlet red dress that seemed to have been designed specifically for her, fitted enough to follow every curve of her body elegantly, yet flowing at the hem, creating a smooth movement with each step. The discreet cutout on the back revealed just enough tanned skin, and the fabric shimmered subtly under the natural light flooding the hall. Her brown hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, dancing lightly with the breeze that came in with her. There was a slight flush on her cheeks, apart from being late, apart from the embarrassment of interrupting the ceremony, but her eyes, her gray-green eyes sparkled with a mixture of determination and sweetness that Henry had never seen before. She crossed the center aisle with quick steps, but not rushed ones. She apologized in a husky whisper to the guests in the first rows, and then her eyes met his. It was as if lightning struck through Henry's chest. The air left his lungs all at once. He felt an unexpected warmth rise from the base of his neck, spreading throughout his body. For the first time in years, his analytical mind went completely silent. There were no calculations, no strategies, no distance. There was only her. Millionaire held his gaze for a moment, a second, maybe two, but it felt like an eternity. A small smile touched her lips, almost conspiratorial, as if saying, "Yes, I know I caused a scene." "So what?" Henry smiled back. Not the polite, calculated smile he used in business meetings. It was a genuine smile, involuntary, impossible to contain. She looked away first, continuing to the altar where the bride Sophie was already positioned. Millionaire took her place beside the other bridesmaids, adjusting her dress with delicate hands, and Henry realized he was still holding his breath. David, the groom, shot a curious look at Henry, eyebrows raised, a mischievous smile on his lips. Henry ignored it, keeping his eyes fixed ahead, but his heart was pounding like it hadn't in years. The ceremony continued, but Henry barely heard the officiant's words. His attention was completely captured by the woman in red, who now held the bride's bouquet standing beside the altar. He watched the way she lightly bit her lower lip when something moved her, the way her eyes sparkled when Sophie and David exchanged vows, the single tear that rolled down her cheek when the couple kissed. She was pure emotion, pure life, pure truth. And Henry, for the first time, felt completely alive. When the ceremony ended, and guests began to stand, applauding and chatting animatedly, Henry remained seated for a moment. He needed to process what had just happened. It didn't make sense. He didn't believe in love at first sight. That was the stuff of cheap romantic movies and self-help books. It was irrational, impulsive, childish, but his heart didn't care about logic. He stood up, adjusting his jacket, and followed the flow of guests toward the garden where the cocktail hour would take place. The outdoor space was equally impressive. Edison pendant lights creating a magical atmosphere among the trees, high-top tables with white tablecloths strategically scattered about, an outdoor bar serving sophisticated drinks, soft jazz music floated through the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Henry grabbed a glass of champagne and watched from a distance. He saw her again. Malene was beside Sophie, laughing at something the bride had said, carefully adjusting her veil. There was an intimacy in that gesture, a deep friendship that was evident in every movement. She's something special, isn't she? Henry turned and found David beside him, still dressed as the groom, with that annoying smile of someone who knew exactly what was happening. Who? Henry tried to sound casual, but his voice betrayed him. Don't even try, man. I saw the way you looked at her when she walked in. I thought you were going to pass out. Henry took a sip of champagne, avoiding David's gaze. Malene is Sophie's best friend since college. Lives in New York, works in interior design. She's amazing at what she does. David made a dramatic pause. And she's single. Henry felt his heart race again, but kept his expression neutral. That doesn't mean anything to me. Of course it doesn't. David patted him on the shoulder. But in case you change your mind, she's right there. And you should go talk to her before someone with fewer hang-ups than you does. David walked away laughing, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. He looked again in Malene's direction. She was now alone, observing the lit garden, holding a glass of rosé wine. The wind played with her hair, and she closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the beauty of that instant. Henry made a decision. He crossed the garden with firm steps, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind screaming at him to pull back. But something stronger, something visceral and impossible to ignore, pushed him forward. When he stopped beside her, Malene opened her eyes and turned. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They just looked at each other. And Henry realized she was nervous too, the way her fingers gently gripped the glass, the slight flush that returned to color her cheeks. You arrived late, Henry finally said with a half-smile. But you transformed the entire room with it. Malene tilted her head, a playful smile touching her lips. It was intentional. I like making memorable entrances. Mission accomplished. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made Henry's chest tighten. And you are... Henry? Henry Callahan, friend of the groom. Malene Wright, friend of the bride. She extended her hand, and when Henry touched it, he felt an electric current run up his arm. Her skin was soft, warm, and he held on for a second longer than socially acceptable. Neither of them seemed to mind. And as the music continued playing and the lights danced among the trees, Henry knew with that silent, terrifying certainty that his life would never be the same again. The evening moved forward with the smoothness of a familiar melody. But for Henry and Mellon, every second seemed suspended in the air, loaded with unspoken possibilities. They remained there in the garden, illuminated by hundreds of small lights hanging from the trees like captured stars, surrounded by the distant murmur of conversations and laughter, but completely isolated in their own universe. Henry held his champagne glass but barely touched it. All his attention was focused on the woman in front of him, the way she tilted her head slightly when listening, the way her eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity, the soft smile that played on her lips as if holding delicious secrets. So, Henry Callahan, Malene began, taking a small sip of her rosé wine. What does a friend of the groom do for a living when he's not attending wedding ceremonies and making charming comments about late arrivals? Henry laughed softly, surprising himself with his own ease. He didn't usually laugh like that, unguarded, genuine. I work in construction, commercial projects, mainly skyscrapers, business complexes, big, noisy things that transform urban landscapes. A builder of concrete empires, she said with a playful tone, but her eyes revealed genuine interest. That must be intense. And lonely. The observation caught him off guard. Most people reacted with superficial admiration, asking questions about money or properties. But Malene had seen beyond, straight to the loneliness he carried like a second skin. Sometimes, he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. And you? Interior design, right? David told me. Malene raised an eyebrow, amused. Ah, so you've been doing research. Let's just say I received inside information. She laughed, and the sound filled Henry's chest with a strange, comforting warmth. "Yes, I'm an interior designer. I have my own studio in New York. I work mainly with residential spaces. I help people transform houses into homes. It's different from what you do. You create structures. I create atmospheres." "Structure and soul," Henry murmured, more to himself than to her. "Maybe we're more alike than it seems." Meline observed him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher hidden layers. Then, with a soft smile, she said, "Maybe. Or maybe we're exactly what the other needs to be complete." The statement hung in the air between them, bold, vulnerable, loaded with a meaning that both felt but neither dared to name yet. Henry took a step closer, closing the distance between them. He could smell her perfume now, something floral and warm, with notes of jasmine and vanilla that made his head spin slightly. "Are you always this direct?" he asked, his voice huskier than he intended. "Only when it matters," she replied, holding his gaze without blinking. The wind blew softly, carrying with it the scent of the garden flowers and the promise of something new. Meline shivered slightly. The red dress, despite being stunning, didn't offer much protection against the evening breeze. Without thinking, Henry removed his jacket and placed it over her shoulders. His fingers brushed the bare skin of her back for an instant, just a fleeting touch, but enough to make them both catch their breath. "Thank you," Meline whispered, pulling the jacket closer to her body. She could feel his warmth still embedded in the fabric, and something inside her melted. "I can't let you freeze while we're having the most interesting conversation I've had in years." "Years?" Meline teased. "Is that sad or flattering?" "Both, maybe." They began walking slowly through the garden, side by side, with no specific destination, just following the path of illuminated stones that wound between flower beds and ancient trees. The music from the party followed them like a distant soundtrack, but they were completely absorbed in each other. "Tell me something real about you," Meline suddenly asked, stopping under a tree covered in lights. "Something you don't tell people at events like this." Henry hesitated. Vulnerability wasn't his strong suit, but something in those gray-green eyes made him want to be honest, to be seen. "I build things because it's easier than building connections. Concrete and steel make sense. They follow rules, blueprints, logic. People—" He paused, searching for the right words. "People are unpredictable, scary." Meline nodded slowly, as if she understood perfectly. "And yet here you are, talking to me." "Here I am," Henry agreed, his eyes fixed on hers, completely terrified. "Good," she smiled, and there was a sweetness in that smile that disarmed all his defenses. "Because I am too." Henry raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. But Meline stood still, watching him with that silent intensity that made him feel naked. He gently touched a strand of hair that the wind had blown across her face, carefully brushing it away and tucking it behind her ear. His fingers grazed her skin, the line of her jaw, the curve of her ear, and he felt Meline tremble under his touch, not from cold, but from something completely different. "You are—" Henry began. But the words died in his throat. How do you describe what he was feeling? How do you put into words the sensation of falling and flying at the same time? "I know," Meline whispered, and Henry realized she really did know. She felt the same. His hand was still close to her face, and Meline, in a gesture that seemed both bold and completely natural, tilted her head slightly, pressing her cheek against his palm. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the sensation, the warmth of her skin, the softness, the absurd intimacy of that simple gesture. "Meline." Sophie's voice broke through the moment, like an unwanted alarm clock. They both stepped back quickly, like teenagers caught doing something forbidden. The bride approached with a radiant smile, still in her white dress, followed by David. "There you are. We've been looking everywhere. I need you for photos with the bridesmaids." Meline smiled at her friend, but Henry saw the reluctance in her eyes. "Of course. I'm coming." Sophie looked between the two with a mischievous gleam in her eyes. "Sorry to interrupt. Whatever was happening here, just talking," Meline said quickly, but the blush on her cheeks betrayed her. David put his arm around Henry's shoulders, dragging him a few steps back. "Let the girls go. You and I need to talk." Meline handed the jacket back to Henry, her fingers lingering on his for a second too long. Their eyes met again, and in that look there was a silent promise. "This isn't over." "See you later," she asked softly, only for him to hear. "Definitely," Henry replied, his voice carrying something he couldn't name. Meline followed Sophie toward the hall, but looked back one last time. Henry remained there, watching her disappear among the lights and guests, the jacket still warm from her body in his hands. "Man," David said beside him, shaking his head with a smile, "you're completely lost." "I know," Henry admitted without taking his eyes off the place where Meline had disappeared. And for the first time in his life, being lost seemed exactly where he should be. Later, when the photos were finished and guests began moving toward the main hall for dinner and dancing, Henry searched for her in the crowd. And when he finally found her sitting at the bridesmaids' table, laughing at something someone had said, her eyes sparkling under the hall lights, she felt his gaze and turned. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and both knew the night was only beginning. The reception hall had completely transformed. Elegant tables surrounded a dance floor lit by soft lights that shifted from golden to amber tones, creating an intimate and enveloping atmosphere. The live band had taken over from the string quartet, filling the space with melodies that invited bodies to move, hearts to open. Henry sat at his table, but his eyes couldn't stray from Meline. She was on the other side of the hall, chatting animatedly with other bridesmaids, but from time to time her gaze met his. And each time it happened, it was as if an invisible current pulled them toward each other. David and Sophie had already performed their traditional opening dance, a beautiful, emotional moment that drew applause and some tears from the guests. Now the floor was open to everyone, and couples began to form, moving to the rhythm of a soft, enveloping ballad. Henry took the last sip of his whiskey, feeling the burn slide down his throat, and made a decision. He wasn't a man who hesitated in business. He closed million-dollar deals with firmness and confidence. But this was different. This required a courage he didn't know if he possessed. Still, he stood up. He crossed the hall with firm steps, his heart beating so hard he could hear it above the music. Some guests greeted him along the way, but he just waved politely without stopping. He had a single objective. When he reached Meline's table, she was laughing at something one of the bridesmaids had said, her head thrown back slightly, eyes closed in pure joy. But when she sensed his presence, she opened her eyes, and the smile transformed into something softer, more intimate. "Henry," she said. And there was a sweetness in the way she pronounced his name that made something inside him melt. "Meline." He extended his hand, aware that all the other bridesmaids were watching them with poorly disguised interest. "Would you dance with me?" For a moment she just looked at him, and Henry saw a flash of vulnerability in those gray-green eyes, as if she too stood on the edge of something frightening and inevitable. Then she placed her hand in his. "I'd love to." The sensation of her skin against his was electric. Henry led her to the dance floor, aware of every point where their bodies touched his hand holding hers, the slight brush of their arms. When they finally stopped in the center of the floor, under the amber light that wrapped around them like a warm embrace, Henry hesitated for just a second before placing his hand on her waist. The fabric of the red dress was soft under his hands, but he could feel the warmth of her body through it. Meline placed her hand on his shoulder, and suddenly they were so close that Henry could feel her breathing, the jasmine and vanilla perfume already etched in his memory. The music began a slow, enveloping melody with piano and violin intertwined in a dance of their own, and they began to move. At first it was hesitant, careful, but then something happened, an inexplicable synchronicity, as if their bodies had known each other for a long time. Henry guided her gently, but Meline followed with a confidence that surprised him. Each step was a silent conversation, each movement a revelation. "You dance well," Meline murmured, her eyes fixed on his chest, as if afraid to meet his gaze. "Mandatory lessons in adolescence," Henry replied with a half-smile. "My mother insisted that every gentleman should know how to dance." She was right. Meline finally raised her eyes, and when their gazes met, Henry felt the air sucked from his lungs. They were so close now he could count every eyelash, see the small golden flecks in her eyes, feel the warmth radiating from her. "Meline," he began, but didn't know how to finish the sentence. She smiled a small, nervous, completely disarmed smile. "I know." His hand on her waist moved slightly, rising a few inches up her back. feeling the curve of her spine through the dress. Meline closed her eyes for a moment, and Henry saw her lips part slightly, as if trying to control her breathing. Around them, other couples danced, talked, laughed. But Henry and Mellon could have been completely alone in the universe. Nothing else existed beyond the music, the soft light, and the ever-shrinking space between their bodies. "Can I tell you a secret?" Meline whispered so low that he had to lean his head in to hear. "Always. I don't usually do this, feel this so quickly." Henry pulled her imperceptibly closer. Now there was practically no space between them. His chest grazed hers with each breath, and he could feel her heart beating fast, racing, mirroring his. "Me neither," he admitted, his voice husky. "Actually, I didn't know it was possible. And now? Now." Henry paused, allowing himself to absorb the moment, the weight of her in his arms, the warmth, the vulnerability. "Now I know I spent my whole life waiting for this without knowing it." Meline bit her lower lip, and Henry saw her eyes shine with contained emotion. "Henry, you can't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because it makes me believe. And that's bad." She laughed softly, but there was a sadness in that sound that made Henry's heart tighten. "I've believed before," she continued, "and it hurt too much when it ended." There it was, the invisible scar she carried. Henry felt a wave of protectiveness so strong it scared him. He wanted to wrap her up completely, protect her from any past or future pain, make her never doubt being loved again. "Who hurt you?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost a growl. Meline shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter anymore. Or at least I thought it didn't matter, until I met you." The music continued, but they barely moved now. They stood in the center of the floor, wrapped around each other, oblivious to the world. Henry released her hand and, with a boldness that surprised him, raised it to her face, caressing her cheek with his thumb. Meline closed her eyes under his touch, leaning her head slightly against his hand. "Look at me," he asked softly. She opened her eyes slowly, and what Henry saw there destroyed and rebuilt him at the same time. Desire, fear, hope, vulnerability, all mixed in a silent storm. "You make me forget everything," Henry whispered. The words came out unfiltered, straight from the deepest place in his soul. "All the rules I created to protect myself, all the walls I built, you walked through all of them in a matter of hours." A single tear rolled down Meline's cheek, and Henry caught it with his thumb, drying it with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. "What if we're moving too fast?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if this is just an illusion of one magical night?" "Then let it be," Henry replied, his forehead touching hers now, their faces so close they shared the same air. "But what if it's not? What if this is exactly what it should be?" Meline let out a trembling sigh, and her hands, which had been resting on his shoulder and chest, rose to wrap around his neck. Her fingers played with the strands of hair at the nape of his neck, sending shivers down his entire spine. The music came to an end, but they didn't move. They remained there, intertwined, lost in each other, while polite applause from the other guests filled the hall. David appeared beside them with Sophie in his arms, both smiling as if they had just witnessed something magical. "Are you two planning to leave the dance floor at some point?" David teased, but his voice was gentle, affectionate. Henry and Meline stepped apart slowly, reluctantly, but their hands remained intertwined. "Sorry," Meline said, laughing nervously and wiping her eyes. Sophie just smiled, giving her friend a knowing wink. "Don't apologize. It was beautiful." As the newlyweds walked away to greet other guests, Henry led Meline off the floor, but didn't let go of her hand. She didn't let him let go. They found a quieter corner of the hall near a large window overlooking the lit garden. The music had changed to something more upbeat, and the floor was now filled with guests dancing energetically. But Henry and Meline remained in their small sanctuary, just watching, still connected. "What do we do now?" Meline asked softly, her eyes searching his. Henry squeezed her hand, intertwining their fingers. "We don't let this end here." She bit her lip, and he saw hesitation battle with desire in her eyes. "I live in New York. You, Boston. But that's not so far." "Henry, give me a chance," he interrupted, his voice carrying an urgency he couldn't hide. "Give me the chance to prove this is real." Meline looked at him for a long moment, and Henry saw the exact moment she made the decision, when fear gave way to hope, when protection gave way to possibility. "Okay," she whispered. "One chance." And when she smiled that beautiful, disarmed smile, full of promises, Henry knew there was no going back. He was completely, irrevocably in love. And, for the first time in his life, that didn't scare him. It set him free. The party was still going strong when Henry and Mellon decided to escape for a few moments. The hall was too hot, too crowded, too loud. They needed air, space, silence, or perhaps they just needed each other without the interference of the world around them. "Want to take a walk?" Henry asked, leaning in so she could hear him over the loud music. His hand was still intertwined with hers, and neither had made any move to let go since the dance. Malene nodded, relieved. She needed to process the whirlwind of emotions consuming her, the fear, the hope, the overwhelming desire she felt every time she looked at this man who, just a few hours ago, had been a complete stranger. They left the hall through a side door that led to the property's back gardens. The night was clear, with stars dotting the sky like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The crescent moon hung low on the horizon, bathing everything in a silvery, ethereal light. The night air was fresh, laden with the perfume of jasmine and roses growing in carefully maintained beds. In the distance, they could hear the sound of the party-muffled music, occasional laughter, but there in the garden it was as if they had found a secret sanctuary. "Better?" Henry asked, observing her profile under the moonlight. The red dress looked almost black in the darkness, but she still glowed. "Much better," Malene replied, breathing deeply. "I love Sophie. I love weddings. But sometimes it's too many people, too much energy. I understand completely." Henry guided her along a stone path that wound between ancient trees. "I spend most of my days surrounded by people, meetings, negotiations, events, but I feel alone in most of them." Malene squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of understanding. "Loneliness in the middle of a crowd. I know that feeling well." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, just appreciating each other's presence. The sound of their footsteps on the grass, the gentle breeze in her hair, the warmth of their intertwined hands, everything seemed amplified, significant. "Can I ask you something?" Henry finally said, stopping under a weeping willow whose canopy created a natural curtain around them. "Always. You said you believed before and got hurt. What happened?" Malene sighed, and Henry saw pain pass through her eyes like a shadow. She turned, looking at the lit garden in the distance, as if she needed physical distance to talk about something that still hurt. "I was engaged," she began, her voice low but firm. 3 years ago, I thought he was the love of my life. We planned everything, the house, the kids, the entire future. I was so sure." She paused, and Henry saw her hands tremble slightly. He moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her, offering silent support. Malene allowed herself to relax against him, grateful for the solidity of his presence. "And then, 2 weeks before the wedding, I found out he was having an affair with my cousin." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Cliché, right? But the pain wasn't cliché. It was devastating." Henry held her tighter, feeling anger toward a man he'd never met, toward someone capable of hurting something so precious. "He was an idiot," Henry said, his voice rough with contained emotion. "Maybe. But what hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing I had built an entire imaginary life with someone who was never real. I was so in love with the idea of him, the idea of us, that I never really saw who he was." Malene turned in his arms, facing him. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, but there was strength in them too. The strength of someone who survived and chose to keep believing, even while afraid. "Since then, I've built walls. I've dated people, of course, but I never let anyone truly get close. Never risked feeling this again. Until now," Henry completed softly, caressing her face. "Until now," she agreed, and there was fear in her voice, but also a quiet courage that impressed him deeply. Henry took her face between his hands, forcing her to look at him. "I'm not him. I'm not going to hurt you, Malene. I know it's too early to make promises. I know we barely know each other, but—" He paused, searching for the right words. "But I feel something when I look at you, something that goes beyond logic, beyond time. And I want to explore this. I want to truly know you. Not the idea of you, but you. Your fears, your scars, your dreams, everything. Malene let out a trembling sigh, and a tear finally escaped, rolling down her cheek. Henry wiped it away with his thumb, that gesture already becoming familiar between them. "You scare me," she admitted, "because I want to believe. And that terrifies me." "I'm scared too," Henry confessed, his forehead touching hers. "I've spent my whole life avoiding exactly this. Control is everything to me, in business, in relationships, in everything. But with you, I don't want to control anything. I just want to feel." They stayed like that for a long moment, exchanging breaths, hearts beating in sync. Then Malene took a step back, wiping her eyes and offering a small but genuine smile. "Your turn. Tell me something about you, something that scares you." Henry laughed softly, running his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that Malene was already beginning to recognize. "I'm afraid of waking up one day and realizing I built an empire, but forgot to build a life. I'm afraid of reaching 60, looking around and seeing only projects, achievements, numbers, but no real memories, no true love." "That's not fear," Malene said softly. "That's awareness. And it's brave to recognize it. My father was like that," Henry continued, surprised by how easily the words flowed. "He never talked about this. He built a fortune, left an incredible business legacy. But when he died 5 years ago, I realized I barely knew him. Didn't know what he loved beyond work, what made him laugh, what he dreamed about when he was young. And I swore I wouldn't be like that." He hesitated. "But I'm becoming exactly like him." Malene took his hand, intertwining their fingers again. "No, you're not. Because you're here now, being vulnerable, being real. Could your father do that?" Henry shook his head slowly. "No, never." "Then you're already different." They resumed walking, closer now, with Malene resting her head on his shoulder. Henry put his arm around her waist, keeping her close, and she fit perfectly against him, as if they had been designed for this. "What do you love to do?" Malene suddenly asked. "Outside of work, what makes you happy?" Henry thought for a moment and realized with sadness that the answer didn't come easily. "I used to love drawing architecture mainly. Before I took over my father's company, I dreamed of being an architect, creating spaces that touched people, that told stories." "And why did you stop?" "Responsibility. Expectations. The company needed me after he died, and drawing seemed frivolous compared to running a construction empire." Malene stopped walking and turned to him, her eyes shining with intensity. "It's not frivolous. It's your soul. And you should go back to doing it." The simplicity and conviction in her voice disarmed him. "Maybe. And you? What makes you happy?" Malene's face lit up in a way that made Henry's chest tighten. "Creating spaces that become homes. Seeing a client walk into an environment I designed and start crying because they finally feel at home. I love colors, textures, the way light completely changes a space. And I love when people let me tell their stories through the spaces I create for them." "You transform structures into souls," Henry said, echoing what she had said earlier. "I build the bones, you give them life." Malene smiled, and it was the most beautiful smile Henry had ever seen. "We should work together someday. You build, I decorate. It would be perfect." "It would be," Henry agreed. But both knew they were talking about something bigger than professional projects. The path led them to a small ornamental pond, where an arched wooden bridge crossed the dark water. They stopped in the middle of the bridge, looking at the moon's reflection on the smooth surface. "Malene," Henry said, his voice serious now, "when the party's over, when you go back to New York, and I go to Boston, I don't want this to end here." She turned to him, and in the silvery moonlight, she looked ethereal, almost unreal. "I don't either, but I'm so afraid." "Then let's be afraid together," he interrupted, taking both her hands. "But let's not let fear win. Not again." Malene bit her lip, considering. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay. But promise me one thing. Anything. If at some point this becomes just an idea, just a fantasy, promise we'll be honest. That we won't build something false just because we want it to work." Henry pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I promise. And you promise the same?" "I promise." They sealed the promise with a long, deep embrace, two strangers who somehow were no longer strangers, two lonely souls who found something like home in each other's arms. In the distance, they heard voices approaching other guests also seeking fresh air. Reluctantly, they began walking back toward the hall. "Tomorrow," Henry said as they approached the light and sound of the party. "Can I take you to your hotel?" Millionaire looked at him. And there was promise in that look. "I'd love that." And as they entered the hall again, where the party still pulsed with life and music, both carried something new, a fragile but bright hope, a terrifying but irresistible possibility, the beginning of something neither of them knew exactly what it was, but both desperately wanted to discover. 3 days had passed since the wedding, 3 days that felt like 3 weeks to Henry. He tried to focus on work. There were important meetings, contracts waiting for his signature, decisions only he could make. But his mind was 200 miles away in New York, with a woman in a red dress who had turned his world upside down. They had exchanged messages, many messages, conversations that started early in the morning and stretched late into the night about everything and nothing at the same time. She sent photos of projects she was working on, color palettes, fabrics, sketches. He sent photos of construction sites, sunsets seen from the tops of his buildings. They shared songs, random thoughts, small pieces of their lives, but it wasn't enough. Henry wanted to see her, needed to see her, needed to know if what he'd felt that night was real or just the product of a romantic atmosphere, champagne, and fairy lights. Deep down, he already knew the answer, but he needed confirmation. On the morning of the 4th day, Henry made an impulsive decision, something completely out of character for him. He canceled all his meetings, ignored his assistant's protests, and booked a flight to New York. He didn't tell Millionaire, didn't plan, just went. 2 hours later, he was in a taxi crossing Manhattan, his heart beating with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He knew where she'd be. She had casually mentioned in a message that she always had late breakfast at a specific cafe in the West Village on Thursdays, her only break in a busy week. When the taxi stopped in front of the small cafe with sidewalk tables and exposed brick walls, Henry hesitated. What if she got angry? What if she thought he was being invasive? What if she wasn't alone? But then he saw her through the glass window, sitting alone at a corner table with an open laptop and a cup of coffee beside her. She wore an oversized mustard-colored sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, reading glasses he didn't know she wore. She was completely focused on the screen, absent-mindedly biting her lower lip. She was even more beautiful than he remembered. Henry paid the taxi, took a deep breath, and entered the cafe. The bell above the door chimed softly, and a few people looked up. But Millionaire remained absorbed in whatever she was doing. Henry approached slowly, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the buzz of conversations and the hum of the espresso machine. When he stopped beside her table, casting a shadow over the laptop, Millionaire finally looked up. Recognition took a second. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened in surprise. Her hand flew to her chest as if she needed to calm the heart that had surely started racing. "Henry?" Her voice was a mixture of shock and something that sounded dangerously like joy. "What? How? You're in New York?" "I'm in New York," he confirmed, a nervous smile playing on his lips. "Surprise?" Millionaire stood up so quickly she almost knocked over her coffee cup. For a moment they just looked at each other, and then she was in his arms, throwing herself against him with a force that caught him off guard. Henry wrapped his arms around her immediately, burying his face in her hair, inhaling that familiar scent of jasmine and vanilla that had haunted his dreams for days. "You're really here," she murmured against his chest, and he felt the vibration of her voice through his shirt. "I couldn't stay away anymore," Henry admitted, pulling her back slightly so he could see her face. "I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other, but—" Millionaire placed her fingers over his lips, silencing him. "Don't apologize. I'm glad you came." Her eyes shone with genuine emotion, and Henry felt something inside him relax. She was happy. She wanted him to be there. "Are you busy?" he asked, looking at the laptop still open on the table. "I might be interrupting." "You are interrupting," she said with a mischievous smile, "and I couldn't care less." They sat down, and Millionaire closed the laptop, giving him her full attention. The waiter came to the table, and Henry ordered a black coffee. When they were alone again, A comfortable silence settled between them, not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but that of people who already feel at ease in each other's presence. "So," Malene began, resting her chin on her hand and observing him with those perceptive eyes, "you flew to New York just to have coffee with me." "I flew to New York because I can't stop thinking about you," Henry replied with brutal honesty. "Because every message we exchanged makes me want more. Because I need to know if what I felt that night was real, or if it was just a moment." Malene reached her hand across the table, and Henry took it immediately, intertwining their fingers. "It was real," she said softly. "I felt it too. Still do." The relief Henry felt was so intense it was almost physical. "Then spend the day with me," he asked. "Show me your city. Show me what you love. Let me truly get to know you." Malene bit her lip, considering. Then, with a smile that lit up her entire face, she nodded. "Okay. But you'll have to handle a lot of walking. I know New York on foot. I'd handle anything with you." They finished their coffees talking about nothing and everything. She told him about a difficult client. He talked about a project that was about to be completed. But the words didn't matter as much as the way they looked at each other, how their hands remained intertwined on the table, how the world around them disappeared when they were together. When they left the cafe, the day was sunny and fresh, typical fall weather in New York. The streets were full of life, hurried people, honking taxis, the smell of street food mixed with the aroma of dry leaves. Malene guided him through the narrow streets of the West Village, pointing out places she loved: an old bookstore with a pet cat, a vinyl record shop where she spent hours, a small park where she liked to sketch on weekends. "You draw?" Henry asked, surprised. "Not professionally, but I like to do hand sketches before moving to the computer. It's more personal that way." They continued walking, now holding hands naturally, as if they'd always done it. Henry observed how she greeted the flower stand owner, how she stopped to pet every dog that passed, how her eyes lit up when she saw something beautiful, an old facade, a window with flowers, the way light filtered through the trees. She saw beauty in everything, and that fascinated him. "I have to confess something," Malene said as they crossed Washington Square Park. "When you didn't tell me you were coming, I got a little nervous. I thought, what if the magic of that night doesn't repeat itself? What if we meet again and don't feel anything?" Henry stopped walking, pulling her closer. "And now, what do you feel?" Malene looked at him, and there was a raw vulnerability in her eyes that made his heart tighten. "I feel more. Much more. And it scares me as much as it excites me." "Me too," Henry admitted, caressing her face. "But I want to keep feeling. I want to see where this goes." They resumed walking, eventually reaching the High Line, the elevated park built on an old railway line. It was one of Malene's favorite places, and Henry immediately understood why. The combination of nature and urban structure, the greenery growing over concrete, the view of the city from a different perspective. It was architectural poetry. "You see," Mellon said, gesturing to the space around them, "they took something that was dead, abandoned, and transformed it into life. Gave new purpose to something people wanted to tear down." Henry pulled her to a bench under a pergola covered in wisteria. They sat side by side, watching the flow of people, tourists taking photos, families with children, couples in love. "That's what you do with spaces," Henry said thoughtfully. "You resurrect them, give them new life." "And that's what you do too," Malene replied, turning to face him. "You create structures that last generations, places where people live, work, create memories." "I never thought of it that way," Henry admitted. "I always saw my work as transactions, projects. But you make it seem meaningful. Because it is." Malene placed her hand over his chest, where she could feel his heart beating. "Everything we do with love and intention is meaningful." Henry covered her hand with his, keeping it there. "You make me want to do better. Be better. You're already incredible, Henry. You just forgot to see it." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The golden light bathed Malin's face, and Henry thought he'd never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. "Have dinner with me," he said suddenly. "Let me take you to dinner." Malene smiled, and there was mischief in that smile. "Only if you let me choose the place. Nothing fancy and formal. Deal." She took him to a small Italian restaurant in the East Village. Authentic, family-run, with tight tables and waiters who knew all the customers by name. They ate homemade pasta and drank red wine, talking for hours about their lives, their fears, their dreams. Henry discovered she had lost her mother when she was 15, and that her father had remarried too quickly to someone Malene never could fully accept. She discovered he had a younger sister he adored but with whom he rarely spoke because he didn't know how to be vulnerable, even with family. They shared scars and hopes, failures and triumphs. And with each revelation, the connection between them deepened, becoming something more solid, more real. When they left the restaurant, it was already night, and New York glowed with millions of lights. Henry insisted on walking her home, and Malene didn't protest. They walked slowly, prolonging the moment, neither wanting the night to end. When they finally reached her building in Chelsea, they stopped in front of the entrance. Malene turned to him, and there was something in her eyes. Desire, fear, invitation. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "It was perfect. You don't need to thank me. I'm the one who's grateful you let me into your world." They stood there very close, the air between them charged with unresolved tension. Henry wanted to kiss her, God, how he wanted to. But something made him hesitate, the fear of ruining the perfection of the moment, of moving too fast. Malene, as if reading his thoughts, stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek, lingering there for a moment that felt like an eternity. "Good night, Henry," she whispered against his skin. "Good night, Malene." She pulled away reluctantly, entering the building. Before the door closed completely, she turned one last time. "When do I see you again?" Henry smiled. "Tomorrow, if you'll let me." "I will." And then she disappeared inside the building, leaving Henry alone on the sidewalk, smiling like a lovesick fool because that's exactly what he was. The next morning arrived with a bright blue sky and a fresh breeze that carried the promise of a perfect day. Henry woke up in his hotel with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, pure anticipation without anxiety, without the weight of responsibilities, just the excitement of seeing Malene again. She had sent a message at 7 in the morning. "Come to my studio. Want to show you where the magic happens. Address, 428 West 25th Street, 3rd floor. Bring coffee." Henry smiled as he read it, already imagining her writing it, probably still in bed with messy hair and that oversized sweater she wore yesterday. He stopped at a cafe on the way and got 2 lattes, one with caramel, because she had casually mentioned during dinner that it was her favorite, and he stored every detail as if they were small treasures. Her studio was in an old brick building in Chelsea, with creaky stairs and walls that told stories of decades past. Henry climbed the 3 flights, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with the scent of paint and wood that permeated the building. The studio door was ajar, and he could hear soft music playing inside, something jazz instrumental, perfect for working. He knocked lightly before pushing the door open and entering, and then he stopped, simply absorbing what he saw. The space was magical. Enormous floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the environment with natural light, creating a golden glow that made everything seem ethereal. The walls were white, but every inch was covered with inspiration. Mood boards with fabrics, photos, magazine cutouts, color palettes ranging from soft to vibrant. A large work table dominated the center of the space, covered with material samples, woods, metals, stones, fabrics of every imaginable texture. There were sketches scattered about, some still in progress, others already finished with detailed notes. Shelves full of design books, architecture, magazines, material catalogs. Plants hung from the ceiling and rested on every available surface, bringing life and oxygen to the creative space. And in the middle of all this was Malene. She had her back to him, leaning over the drawing table, completely absorbed in what she was doing. She wore faded jeans and a white linen blouse that fell loosely over her body, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a low, messy ponytail with loose strands framing her face. There was a graphite pencil tucked behind her ear and another in her hand, moving quickly across the paper. Henry stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. She was so focused, so completely in her element that it was like seeing a version of her the rest of the world rarely witnessed. There was grace in her movements, the way she tilted her head to study the drawing, how she bit her lower lip when something wasn't right, how her graphite-stained fingers danced across the paper. "Are you going to stand there all day or come in?" Malene said without turning around, but he could hear the smile in her voice. Henry laughed, entering the space completely. "How did you know I was here?" "I felt it," she replied simply, finally turning to face him. Her eyes sparkled, and there was a graphite smudge on her cheek that made her look even more adorable. "And you brought coffee, my hero." He handed her the cup, and when their fingers touched, that familiar spark passed between them, constant, inevitable. "Caramel?" she asked after the first sip, her eyes widening with surprise. "You mentioned it yesterday." Malene looked at him with an expression Henry couldn't completely decipher, but there was warmth there and something that seemed dangerously close to admiration. "You pay attention, always." She bit her lip, that gesture he was already beginning to recognize as her sign of happy nervousness, and turned back to the drawing table. "Come, let me show you what I'm working on." Henry approached, standing behind her close enough to feel her warmth, but maintaining a respectful distance. Malene pointed to the drawing on the table, a detailed sketch of a living room with notes about materials, colors, lighting. "This is a project for a young couple in Brooklyn. They just bought their first apartment, a small, kind of dull space, but it has so much potential." Her voice came alive as she spoke, her hands gesturing animatedly. "See here, this wall is going to be deep teal blue, almost like the ocean at dusk. And this window, we're going to remove the old trim and install something cleaner, more modern, to let the light in completely." Henry watched not just the drawing, but the passion that radiated from her, the way she saw possibilities where others would see limitations. "It's beautiful," he said. And he wasn't just talking about the project. Malene turned, and suddenly they were very close. She had to tilt her head back to look at him, and Henry could see every detail of her face, the small freckles on her nose, the golden ring around her pupils, the perfect shape of her lips. "You haven't even seen the best part yet," she said softly, and then took him by the hand, pulling him to another area of the studio. There was a corner that functioned as a small showroom, pieces from previous projects, full-scale samples of designs she had created. Malene guided him through each one, explaining the story behind it, the choices she made, the challenges she overcame. "Interior design isn't just about making things pretty," she explained, gently touching a wine-colored velvet fabric. "It's about understanding people, their stories, their fears, what they need to feel when they come home. This project here," she pointed to photos of a children's room painted in soft tones of mint green and gold, "was for a single mother with a 5-year-old daughter. She had just left an abusive relationship. She needed the space to be safe, welcoming, full of hope. So I chose colors that calm but also energize. I created cozy corners where they could read together. Every detail had a purpose." Henry was completely captivated. He now saw clearly what she did. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about healing, about transformation, about giving people spaces where they could be their best version. "You're incredible," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Malene blush slightly. "It's just what I love to do." "No, it's more than that. You see people, you understand them, and you use that understanding to create something that changes their lives." Malene held his gaze for a long moment, and Henry saw emotion shine in her eyes. "No one has ever described my work that way." Then no one was really paying attention. She took a step closer, eliminating the space between them. Her hands found his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast. "You see me," she whispered. And there was wonder in those words. "Truly, how could I not?" Henry replied, his hands finding her waist naturally, as if they had always belonged there. "You're impossible not to see, Malene. You shine." She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing his words like water in the desert. When she opened them again, there was determination there. "I want to show you something." Malene led him to a more private corner of the studio, where there was a small table with a worn and clearly well-loved sketchbook. She picked up the notebook with reverence, hesitating for a moment before opening it. "These are personal. I don't usually show them to anyone." The pages were full of drawings, not professional projects, but pure art. Sketches of faces, urban landscapes, moments captured in time. There was a drawing of an elderly woman sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons so detailed that Henry could almost feel the texture of her clothes. Another of a child running with a dog, pure joy captured in graphite. "Malene." Henry turned the pages carefully, treating each drawing like the work of art it was. "You're incredibly talented. I draw when I need to process emotions, she explained, watching his reactions. When words aren't enough. Henry stopped at one drawing in particular, a self-portrait of her, but different. Her eyes were sad. Her body seemed bent under an invisible weight. There was a date in the corner 3 years ago. It was right after I canceled the wedding, Malene said softly, noticing where his gaze had stopped. I was lost, broken. I drew this to try to understand who I was without him. Henry touched the drawing gently, as if he could reach through time and comfort that version of her who was suffering. And who did you discover you were? Malene turned the page, and there was another self-portrait more recent by the date. In this one, her eyes sparkled. There was a smile on her lips, and her body was relaxed, confident. I discovered I was complete alone, that I didn't need anyone to define me, and that when the right one came along. She looked at Henry, and there was so much meaning in that look it took his breath away. I would be ready. The air between them became charged, heavy with unspoken things. Henry carefully closed the notebook and placed it back on the table. Then, slowly, he took a step toward her. Malene didn't pull back. Instead, she tilted her face up, her eyes fixed on his, lips slightly parted. Henry raised his hand, caressing her cheek. His thumb passed over the graphite smudge he had noticed before, gently wiping it away. "You have graphite here," he murmured, his voice husky. "I always have graphite somewhere," she replied, and there was a tremor in her voice that revealed how affected she was by his proximity. "It's beautiful." "You are." Henry paused, searching for the right words. "You're pure art, Mellon. Every part of you." She let out a trembling breath, and her hands rose to his chest, grabbing his shirt as if she needed something to anchor herself. "Henry, say it," he encouraged, his forehead touching hers. "Now, kiss me." That was all he needed to hear. Henry leaned in, eliminating the last inch of distance between them, and captured her lips in a kiss that was both gentle and devastating. Her lips were soft, warm, and tasted like caramel coffee and promises. Malene sighed against his mouth, and the sound sent warmth through his body. Her hands left his shirt and rose, intertwining behind his neck, pulling him closer. Henry deepened the kiss, one hand on her waist, the other lost in her hair, undoing the ponytail until it fell loose over her shoulders. She was everything, the taste, the smell, the sensation. Nothing else existed beyond that moment. That kiss that seemed to rewrite all the rules Henry had created for his life. When they finally separated, both were breathless, hearts beating in accelerated sync. Henry pressed soft kisses to her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose as if he couldn't stop touching her. "That," Malene began, but the words died. "I know," Henry said, understanding perfectly because he felt it too. That frightening certainty that something had changed irrevocably, that there was no going back from that moment. They remained intertwined in the sunlit studio, two hearts finally finding their way to each other. And for the first time, neither of them was afraid of what would come next. The following days transformed into a sequence of stolen moments and conversations that stretched into the late hours of the night. Henry had extended his stay in New York indefinitely, managing his company remotely, while spending every free moment with Malene, impromptu dinners, aimless walks, afternoons in her studio where he worked on his laptop while watching her create. It was too easy being together, frighteningly easy. But there was something unspoken hovering between them, a tension that grew with each prolonged look, each touch that lasted longer than it should, each kiss that left them both wanting more. They were dancing around something inevitable, and both knew it. On the fifth night, the weather turned. An autumn storm hit New York with force, strong winds, torrential rain that beat against the windows like impatient fingers, thunder that made the buildings tremble. Henry was in Melene's apartment for the first time, a small but cozy space in Chelsea that was completely her. Walls in soft shades of gray and blue, plants everywhere, eclectic art on the walls, a perfect mix of vintage and modern. They had planned to go out for dinner, but the storm made it impossible. Instead, Malene improvised something in the kitchen: pasta with homemade tomato sauce, red wine, soft music playing in the background, while Henry watched, leaning against the doorframe, completely enchanted by the domesticity of the moment. "You cook?" he asked, surprised. "I manage." Meline replied with a smile, stirring the sauce. I learned out of necessity. After my mom died, my dad kind of gave up on the kitchen. It was either me or pizza every day. I'm sorry about your mother. Meline shrugged, but he saw the pain pass through her eyes. It was a long time ago. But it still hurts, especially because she'll never know the person I became, never see my studio, my projects, or... She paused, looking at Henry with a vulnerable expression. Or meet someone important in my life. The weight of those words hung in the air. Someone important. It was the first time either of them had verbalized what this was becoming. She would be proud of you, Henry said softly, moving closer. Anyone would be. Meline turned to him, and there were tears shining in her eyes that she was trying to hold back. Sorry, didn't mean to get melancholic. Henry pulled her into a hug, and she allowed herself to melt against him, her face hidden in his chest. Never apologize for feeling. It's one of the things I love most about you. Meline pulled back slightly, looking at him with surprise. Love? Henry realized what he'd said, the word that had escaped without filter. He could backtrack, soften it, but he decided to be brave. Yes, love. I know it's too soon. I know I should be more cautious. But Meline... He took her face in his hands. I'm falling in love with you. Probably already am in love. And it terrifies and excites me at the same time. She let out a trembling breath, and a tear finally escaped, sliding down her cheek. Henry, you don't have to say anything, he rushed to add. There's no pressure. I just needed you to know. Meline shook her head, wiping her eyes. No, you don't understand. I am too falling in love. Already in love. But I'm so afraid. Of what? Of messing everything up? Of not being enough? Of you discovering all my broken parts and deciding it's not worth it? The pain in her voice broke Henry's heart. He guided her to the couch, moving away from the stove where the sauce was slowly cooking. They sat side by side. Bodies turned toward each other, knees touching. Tell me about him, Henry asked. About the guy who made you believe you're not enough. Meline took a deep breath, as if preparing to reopen an old wound. His name was Marcus. We met in college. I was 20, he was 23. It was intense from the start. He was charismatic, confident, said everything I wanted to hear. I fell in love so fast, so completely that I completely lost my identity. She paused, looking at her own hands. I changed for him, changed how I dressed, what I ate, even my dreams. He wanted me to work at his family's company instead of pursuing design, and I considered it because I thought love meant sacrifice. Henry felt anger growing inside him but stayed quiet, letting her speak. We planned the wedding for a year. I was so excited, so certain I was building my perfect life. And then 2 weeks before, my cousin, who was one of the bridesmaids, confessed to me they'd been having an affair for months. And the worst part, her voice failed. The worst part is that he said it was my fault, that I wasn't exciting enough, interesting enough, beautiful enough. He was a jerk, Henry said vehemently, and he was completely wrong. I know that now. But at the time I believed him. I spent 2 years thinking there was something fundamentally wrong with me, that I was incapable of being fully loved. Henry took her hands, intertwining their fingers. Look at me. Meline slowly raised her eyes. You're everything. You're beautiful, talented, kind, passionate. You light up every space you enter. And anyone who doesn't see that is blind or an idiot, probably both. She laughed through the tears, and the sound was like music to his ears. You really believe that? With every fiber of my being. Meline moved closer, pressing her forehead against his. I'm afraid of feeling too much and losing everything again, she confessed. Because what I feel for you is infinitely stronger than anything I've ever felt before. And if I lose this, if I lose you, I don't know if I'd survive. Henry released one of her hands and placed it on his own chest, where his heart beat strong and fast. Feel it. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not him. Meline, I would never be capable of hurting you like that. How can you be so sure? Because the idea of causing you pain destroys me. Because when I look at you, I don't see someone who needs to change. I see someone perfect exactly as they are. He hesitated, then decided to go all the way. Because I'm afraid too. I'm afraid of not being the man you deserve, of being too cold, too distant, too damaged by my own past. It was Malene's turn to take his hand and press it against her own heart. Then, let's be afraid together. But let's not let fear win. Outside, a thunderous roar shook the building, and the rain beat with renewed force against the windows. But inside, in the small apartment lit by candles Malene had lit when the power flickered, there was warmth and safety. Henry pulled her onto his lap, and she settled there naturally, arms around his neck, face hidden in the curve between his shoulder and neck. He held her tight, one hand on her back, the other in her hair, simply offering comfort and presence. "Tell me about your father," Malene murmured against his skin. Henry sighed, and she felt the vibration in his chest. He was a difficult man, brilliant in business, but emotionally absent. "My mother tried to compensate. She was all love and warmth. But when she died of cancer 10 years ago, he shut down completely. Worked himself to death, literally. Heart attack at 58. Henry." Her voice was loaded with compassion. "I was with him in the hospital. In his last hours he was semi-conscious, delirious. And you know what he said?" Henry paused, the pain still fresh even years later. He said, "I worked so hard, but for what?" And then he looked at me with such sadness and whispered, "Don't make my mistake, son. Don't forget to live." Malene pulled back to see his face, wiping away tears Henry hadn't even realized were falling. "And are you living now?" Henry looked at her, really looked, absorbing every detail of her face, the warmth of her body against his, the way she looked at him with such tenderness it made his chest ache. "For the first time in years, yes, because of you." Her voice was a hoarse whisper, loaded with emotion. "You wake me up, Malene. You make me feel things I thought I'd never feel. You make me want to be better, do better, truly live instead of just exist." She touched his face with trembling fingers, tracing the line of his jaw, the contour of his lips. "I want to give you everything," she confessed. "Every part of me. But I need to know, is this real for you? It's not just the excitement of something new. It's not just because I'm different from the women you usually meet." Henry held her wrist, keeping her hand against his face. "It's real. It's the most real thing I've ever felt. And yes, you're different, but not the way you're thinking. You're different because you're you. Because you see the world in a way that makes me want to see it too. Because your light is so bright it illuminates even the darkest corners of who I am." Malene closed her eyes, and more tears fell, but now they were tears of something that looked dangerously like hope. "Show me," she whispered, opening her eyes and meeting his. "Show me it's real." Henry didn't need to ask what she meant. He could see it in the fire in her eyes, in the way her body pressed against his, in the accelerated breathing that mirrored his own. He kissed her slowly at first, almost reverent, as if she were something precious he was afraid to break. But Malene deepened the kiss, her hands intertwining in his hair, pulling him closer, asking for more. The outside world disappeared, the storm, the rain, everything. There were only the two of them, finally giving in to what they'd been resisting since that first night at the wedding. When they finally separated, both breathless, Henry pressed his forehead against hers. "Stay with me tonight," he asked. "It doesn't have to be anything more than this. Just stay. Let me hold you." Malene smiled, that beautiful disarmed smile he was beginning to consider his greatest addiction. "Okay, but first, we need to save dinner. I think the sauce is burning." They laughed together, and the sound filled the apartment with lightness and joy. They got up from the couch, and Henry helped her in the kitchen, moving around her with a familiarity that seemed impossible for something so new. Later, after eating pasta burned at the edges but perfect in every other way, after sharing more wine and more stories, they lay together on the couch, intertwined under a soft blanket. The storm continued outside, but inside there was peace. And for the first time in years, both allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, love didn't have to hurt. Maybe it could heal. The weekend arrived with an unexpected invitation. Henry owned a country house on the shores of a lake in upstate New York, a refuge he rarely used, but kept as a reminder of simpler times. It was a place where his family used to spend summers when he was a child, before work consumed everything. "Come with me," he had asked Malene the night before. His fingers intertwined with hers as they walked through the lit streets of Manhattan. Just the two of us. No distractions, no city, no outside world. Meline had hesitated only for a moment before agreeing. There was something in the way he looked at her with desire, yes, but also with tenderness and a vulnerability that completely disarmed her. The car ride took 2 hours, filled with easy conversations and comfortable silences, soft music playing on the radio, while the urban landscape gradually gave way to trees and open space. When they finally arrived, the sun was already beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The house was exactly as Meline had imagined, rustic but elegant, all wood and stone with large windows offering stunning views of the lake. There was a stone fireplace in the center of the living room, a cozy kitchen with antique cabinets, and a master bedroom on the second floor with a terrace opening directly onto the water. "Henry, this is—" Mellon spun slowly, absorbing every detail. "Perfect. It was my mother's favorite place," he said softly, setting their bags on the floor. "She said here she could truly breathe. After she died, my father never came back. I avoided it for a while too many memories." Meline approached him, touching his face gently. "Thank you for bringing me, for sharing this with me." Henry covered her hand with his, turning his face to kiss her palm. "I want to share everything with you." They spent the late afternoon exploring, walking along the lake shore where stones gleamed under the crystal-clear water, sitting on the wooden deck with glasses of wine, while watching the sunset transform everything into liquid gold. Conversation flowed naturally, interspersed with casual touches that became increasingly less casual. His hand on the small of her back, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. The tension between them was palpable, electric, a constant current pulsing beneath every look, every smile. When night fell completely, Henry lit the fireplace while Meline prepared something simple for dinner. They ate on the couch in front of the fire, plates resting on the coffee table, sharing food and laughter, completely at ease in each other's presence. But there was something different about that night. An acute awareness of where they were. Alone, far from everything, with nothing but the crackling of the fire and the occasional call of an owl outside. "Dance with me," Henry said suddenly, extending his hand. "There's no music," Meline pointed out, but she was already smiling. "We don't need it." She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. They began moving slowly, with no rhythm beyond what they created together, swaying only to the sound of the fire and their own synchronized breathing. Meline rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Henry's arms wrapped around her completely, one hand on her back, the other intertwined with hers, keeping her close as if he feared she might disappear. "Meline," he murmured against her hair, "I've never felt this way before, so complete." She raised her head to look at him, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart race intense desire, but also something deeper, more permanent. "Me too," she whispered. The space between them disappeared. Henry took her face in his hands and kissed her, not with the urgency of before, but with a slow, deliberate intensity that made her knees weak. It was a kiss that said things words couldn't express, that promised things both barely dared to believe. Meline's hands rose up his chest, feeling the firm muscles beneath his shirt until they intertwined behind his neck. She pressed against him, eliminating any space that might still exist between their bodies. When the kiss deepened, Henry lifted her in his arms in one smooth motion, and Meline automatically wrapped her legs around his waist. He carried her toward the stairs, stopping occasionally to kiss her again, unable to pull away for more than a few seconds. The bedroom was bathed in half-light, the full moon entering through the large windows, creating silver patterns on the wooden floor. Henry set her down gently at the foot of the bed, but didn't step back. Instead, his hands found her face again, fingers tracing her cheekbones, her jaw as if memorizing every contour. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice husky. "We can stop at any time. There's no pressure." Mellon placed a finger over his lips, silencing him. "I'm sure. More sure than I've been of anything." She took his hands and guided them to the buttons of her blouse, a silent permission. Henry took a deep breath, as if he needed a moment to absorb the reality of what was happening, and then, with fingers that trembled slightly, began unbuttoning each button with reverent attention. The blouse slid off her shoulders and fell to the floor, soon followed by his Meline let her hands explore the width of his shoulders, the contours of his muscles, the small scars that told silent stories of his life. He did the same, fingers tracing the line of her collarbone, the curve of her waist, touching her as if she were something precious and fragile. "You're beautiful," Henry whispered, and there was such sincerity in his voice that Meline felt tears sting her eyes. "Show me it's real," she repeated the words she had said days before, but now with a completely different meaning. Henry responded by capturing her lips again, and this time there was no hesitation. His hands found the clasp of her bra, removing it slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. But Meline didn't want to pull back. She wanted to move forward, dive completely into that moment, into that man who had dismantled all her defenses with his kindness and honesty. They fell onto the bed together, a tangle of limbs and warm skin, exploring each other with curious hands and eager lips. Henry kissed every inch of skin he found, her neck, her shoulders, the valley between her breasts, while Meline arched against him, fingers buried in his hair, sighs escaping from her lips. "Henry," she gasped when his lips found a particularly sensitive spot. "Please, tell me what you want," he murmured against her skin. "I want to hear you say it. I want you. Every part of you. Completely." Something inside Henry broke with those words. He moved over her, supporting himself on his arms so as not to crush her, and looked deeply into her eyes. "I'm yours," he said simply. "Completely yours." When they finally came together, it was with deliberate slowness, each movement intentional, each touch meaningful. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, a complete fusion of two people who had spent so long alone and finally found home in each other. Meline held his face, keeping his eyes fixed on hers as they moved together, creating a rhythm that was uniquely theirs. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, but not from sadness, from relief, from joy, from a completeness she thought she'd never feel again. "I love you," she whispered, and the confession came as naturally as breathing. Henry's eyes widened, and then a smile spread across his face, pure, genuine, radiant. "I love you," he responded, kissing her deeply. "God, how I love you." They lost themselves in each other in shared pleasure, in the absolute intimacy of that moment. The outside world ceased to exist. There was no past, no future, only the perfect and immense now they shared. When they finally reached the peak together, it was with whispered names and silent promises, bodies trembling, souls intertwined in a way that seemed impossible to separate again. Afterward, they lay side by side, skin against skin, bodies still intertwined, breathing gradually calming. Henry pulled the sheet over them and turned on his side to face her, one hand lazily tracing the line of her spine. "I never thought a moment like this could exist," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Meline smiled, caressing his face. "Now it's ours forever." He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips, unable to stop touching her. "Stay with me. Not just today. Always. Always," she agreed. And there was so much weight in that word that both felt it. They fell asleep intertwined as the moon continued its journey across the sky, and the lake shimmered under its silver light, two hearts that had been alone for so long finally finding peace in each other's arms. And when dawn came, bringing with it golden light that flooded the room, they woke still together, still connected, still completely in love. The world had changed during the night, or perhaps they had changed. Either way, nothing would be as it was before. And both couldn't be more grateful for that. The following weeks were like living in a waking dream. Henry had practically moved to New York, managing his company remotely while spending every possible moment with Meline. They had established a routine: breakfasts at their favorite cafe, impromptu lunches at her studio, evenings exploring hidden restaurants, or simply staying home, cooking together and talking until late. It was too easy, too natural, as if they had always been this way. Meline had never felt so seen, so loved, so completely accepted. Henry knew her now, her fears, her scars, her dreams, and not only accepted all of it, but seemed to love her even more because of it. He made her feel safe in a way she didn't know was possible. But the universe, as always, had its own plans. It was an ordinary Tuesday when everything changed. Meline was at the studio working on a project for an important client when her phone vibrated a message from a number she hadn't saved but recognized immediately. Her stomach tightened. "Maddie, need to talk to you." It's important. Please. Marcus. She stared at the phone screen for a long moment, her heart beating irregularly. Marcus. 3 years without any contact. And now he appeared out of nowhere, using the nickname only he used to use as if he had the right. Her hands trembled as she set the phone aside, trying to return to work. But the words on the screen seemed to burn in her retina. Need to talk to you. It's important. Why? Why now? Why precisely when she was finally happy, when she had finally built something real and beautiful with Henry? Another message arrived. I know I have no right to ask, but please, just coffee. I need to say things I should have said a long time ago. Malene took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, curiosity, all mixed in a heavy mass in her chest. She should ignore it, should block the number and move on. But there was a small, annoying part of her that needed to know, needed closure perhaps, or needed to prove to herself that it really didn't mean anything anymore. Without thinking too much, because if she thought about it, she probably wouldn't do it, she typed a response. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., cafe at Chelsea Market. Don't make me wait. The response came almost immediately. I'll be there. Thank you, Maddie. Malene dropped the phone as if it were burning. What had she just done? Why did she agree? And more importantly, should she tell Henry? She spent the rest of the day divided, unable to concentrate completely on work. When Henry showed up at the studio in the late afternoon with Thai food and that smile that always made her heart melt, she almost told him. The words were on the tip of her tongue. But something made her hesitate, maybe fear of worrying him unnecessarily, maybe shame at still feeling anything, even if it was just anger for a man who had hurt her so much, or maybe just wanting to protect the perfect bubble they had built, even if for one more day. So she said nothing, ate with him, laughed at his jokes, let him kiss her as if nothing was wrong. And that night, as they slept intertwined in her bed, she stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, questioning the decision she had made. The next morning, Malene woke before Henry. He was deeply asleep, one arm thrown over her possessively even in sleep. She observed his relaxed face, the worry lines softened, lips slightly parted, and felt a wave of love so intense it almost hurt. She didn't want to lose this. Didn't want to lose him. Carefully, she disentangled herself from his arms and dressed silently. She left a note on the kitchen table. Early meeting with client. Love you, M. And left before he could wake up and ask questions. She wasn't ready to answer. Chelsea Market was busy when she arrived, full of tourists and rushed locals, grabbing coffee before work. Malene found a table in the back of the cafe where they could have some privacy and waited. 10 came. Then 10, 5, 10, 10. For a moment she thought he wouldn't come, and felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. But then, she saw him crossing the cafe with that confident walk she used to find attractive but now just irritated her. Marcus looked different, older perhaps. He had gained some weight, and there were lines around his eyes that weren't there before. But it was still him, the same blue eyes, the same rehearsed smile. Maddie, he said when he reached the table, and there was something in his voice she couldn't identify. Thank you for coming. I know that. Don't call me Maddie, she interrupted, her voice colder than intended. You lost that right 3 years ago. He nodded, swallowing hard, and sat in the opposite chair. Fair. Malene, then. Tense silence settled between them. Malene waited, refusing to make this easy for him. You look beautiful. Marcus tried, but she just stared at him coldly until he looked away. Okay, straight to the point then, please. He took a deep breath. I messed up everything completely. And I've spent the last 3 years trying to understand why. I went to therapy, worked on myself, and realized I was a complete idiot, that I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to explain. Malene crossed her arms, keeping herself protected. If you came here expecting forgiveness— No, he interrupted quickly. I mean, yes, I hope someday you can forgive me. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I broke up with Vanessa with your cousin a year ago. Malene felt a pang, not of pain or jealousy, but of something that looked more like indifference. And I need to know this. Why? Because I realized I made the biggest mistake of my life. That you were everything I needed, and I threw it away for nothing, for empty excitement and inflated ego. He leaned forward, and Malene saw tears shining in his eyes. I still love you, Malene. Never stopped. And I know I don't deserve it, I know I messed up too badly, but is there any chance we could try again?" The words hung in the air like lead. Malene stared at him, at the man she had loved so completely, who she had almost married, who had completely destroyed her ability to trust, and realized with surprising clarity that she felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no pain, not even satisfaction in seeing him suffer. There was just emptiness, like looking at a stranger. "No," she said simply. Marcus blinked, as if he hadn't expected such a direct answer. "Malene, please. I've changed. I'm different now." "It doesn't matter," she interrupted, and her voice was firm. "Sure, you could be a completely different person, could have changed completely, and still the answer would be no. Why? Because I loved you. Past tense. I loved you with every part of who I was, and you took that love and shattered it, made me question my worth, my beauty, my capacity to be loved, and it took me years to rebuild myself." Tears began rolling down her face, but her voice remained steady. "And now I found someone who loves me exactly as I am, who sees all my broken parts and loves them even more because of them, who makes me feel safe, seen, valued. And I'm not going to throw that away for something that died 3 years ago." Marcus was crying now too, and Malene felt a pang of compassion, not love, not desire, just the sadness of seeing another human being suffer. "I really messed up everything, didn't I?" he said, his voice broken. "Yes, you did. But you know what? I'm grateful." He looked up, confused. "Grateful?" "Yes, because if you hadn't destroyed what we had, I never would have found what I truly deserved. I never would have met Henry. Never would have understood the difference between someone who says they love you and someone who actually loves you." Mellon stood up, grabbing her bag. "I hope you find happiness, Marcus. Really. But it won't be with me. It will never be with me again." She started to walk away, but he called her name one last time. "Malene." She stopped, but didn't turn around. "He's very lucky, whoever he is." She looked over her shoulder and smiled, a small but genuine smile. "No, we're both lucky, because we choose each other every day." And then she left the cafe, leaving Marcus and that entire chapter of her life behind definitively. Outside, rain had started to fall, light at first, then heavier. Malene stood on the sidewalk for a moment, face turned to the sky, letting the water wash away the last remnants of that conversation. And then she saw him. Henry was across the street, standing in the rain, completely soaked. His eyes met hers across the distance in the rain, and Malene saw pain and uncertainty in that look. Her heart broke. He had seen, he knew. "Henry!" she shouted, starting to run toward him. But he didn't move, just stood there, rain streaming down his face, hands in his pockets, waiting. When she finally reached him, breathless and drenched, the words came out in a desperate rush. "It's not what you think, I swear. He contacted me yesterday, asked to talk, and I needed closure, needed to prove to myself that it was dead. And it is. It's completely dead. I don't feel anything for him. Nothing except gratitude for having found you." Henry still hadn't said anything, and the silence was killing her. "Please say something. Yell at me. Be angry, anything. Just don't look at me like that." Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Why didn't you tell me? I was afraid." "Afraid? You'd think I still felt something. Afraid of ruining what we have. It was stupid, I know, but—" "Malene," he interrupted, and then did something she didn't expect. He smiled. "You're soaked." She blinked, confused. "What?" "You're soaked and shivering and probably going to catch a cold if we stay here in the rain." "Henry, I'm trying to explain." "I know," he said, pulling her close and wrapping his arms around her. "And I understand you needed closure. It's human. But Malene—" "Yes? Next time. Tell me. Because I trust you completely, and I want you to trust me too." Tears mixed with rain on her face. "You're not angry?" "No. Because I saw you leave that cafe, and I saw everything written on your face. Saw that you chose us. Chose this." He held her tighter. "And that's all I need to know." Malene buried her face in his chest, sobbing now from relief, from love, from gratitude for this incredible man who loved her even when she didn't deserve it. "I love you," she said against his chest. "So much more than I thought it was possible to love someone." "I know," Henry replied, kissing the top of her head. "Now I know." They stood there embracing in the rain, two people who had found their way back to each other through the storm. And when they finally started walking back home, hands intertwined, bodies close, both knew something had changed. The last shadow of the past had been exorcised, and the future for the first time seemed infinitely bright. 6 months had passed since that rainy day when Meline faced her past and chose her future. 6 months of building, growth, and a happiness both barely dared believe was real. Henry had officially transferred the headquarters of his operations to New York, keeping only a small team in Boston. It wasn't an impulsive decision, it was calculated, thought out, but fundamentally motivated by something he had never allowed to guide his choices before: love. And Meline had grown her studio, hiring 2 assistants and accepting larger, more ambitious projects. But the most important project was still to come. It was a clear spring morning when Henry took her to a location he'd kept secret for weeks. They drove about an hour outside the city, Meline trying to extract information from him the entire way. But Henry just smiled mysteriously and kept his lips sealed. "We're almost there," he finally said, turning onto a gravel road lined with ancient trees. "Henry Callahan, if you brought me out here to kill me and hide my body, know that Sophie knows exactly where I am," Meline joked. But there was genuine curiosity in her voice. He laughed, squeezing her hand. "Trust me." And she did, completely. When they finally stopped, Meline looked out the window, and her heart tightened. Before them stood an old mansion, not the exaggerated grandeur of a palace, but the decadent elegance of something that was once magnificent and now forgotten. The stone walls were covered in ivy, broken windows reflected the morning sun, and the surrounding garden had transformed into a beautiful but wild jungle. It was sad and beautiful at the same time. "What is this place?" Meline whispered, getting out of the car as if in a trance. Henry joined her, putting his arm around her waist. It was a private estate, built in the 1922. It belonged to a family of artists, painters, writers, musicians. They used to host salons here, gathering creatives from everywhere. But it was abandoned 15 years ago when the last owner died without heirs. Meline walked toward the entrance, touching the stone walls with reverence. She could feel the history there, the lives that had been lived, the creativity that had flourished. "Why did you bring me here?" Henry approached, standing behind her, hands on her shoulders. "Because I bought it. And I want it to be our project together." Meline turned so fast she almost lost her balance. "You what?" "I bought it. And I have a proposal." His eyes shone with an excitement she rarely saw, the excitement of a man pursuing a dream, not just a profit. "I restore the structure, bring back the architectural integrity, reinforce the foundations, create the bones, and you give it life. Create the spaces, tell the story. But what for?" Henry shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "No. We're going to transform it into an arts and design center, a space where emerging artists can work, exhibit, create. There will be studios, galleries, workshop rooms, a place where creativity can flourish as it flourished here a century ago." Tears began to fill Meline's eyes. "Henry, and there's more." He turned her to face him completely. "I want an entire wing dedicated to your studio. A space where you can work, teach, inspire the next generation of designers. Your name, your vision, your legacy. I don't know what to say." "Say yes. Say you'll build this with me, not just this building, but a life, a future." Meline looked back at the mansion, seeing through the decay to the possibility Henry saw. And then she looked at him, the man who had entered her life like a tornado and transformed absolutely everything. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Henry pulled her into a deep kiss, and when they separated, both were smiling like lovesick fools. "There's one more thing," he said, and there was nervousness in his voice now. "More? How can there be more?" Henry took a deep breath, and then, to Meline's complete shock, got down on one knee. The world stopped. "Meline, right," he began, and his voice trembled slightly. "6 months ago, you walked into that wedding hall in a red dress and turned my life upside down. You taught me to feel, to live, to love without fear. You made me want to be better, do better, build things that matter." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple but stunning ring, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "This stone reminded me of you, strong, rare, absolutely unique. And I know it's fast. I know some would say we're crazy, but when you know, you know. And I know I want to spend every day of the rest of my life loving you, supporting you, building dreams by your side." Tears flowed freely down Meline's face now. "So, my love, my partner, my best friend, will you marry me?" "Yes," Meline practically shouted, pulling him to his feet and throwing herself into his arms. "Yes, yes, yes." Henry laughed, spinning her in the air before setting her back down and sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been destined to be there. They kissed under the morning sun in front of the mansion that would soon become the symbol of everything they built together, and the whole world seemed to celebrate with them. Birds sang. The wind blew gently. Even the wild flowers around them seemed brighter. The following months were a whirlwind of planning, both for the mansion's restoration and for the wedding. Meline insisted on something intimate, just close family and dear friends. Henry agreed easily. All that mattered was her. They decided to marry at the mansion itself, even still under construction. There was something poetic about it, beginning their marriage, in the place that symbolized not just their shared project, but their own journey of restoration and renewal. The wedding day arrived with a perfectly blue sky. The ceremony would be in the garden, which Meline and a team of landscapers had transformed from forgotten jungle to romantic paradise. Wild flowers grew in organized abundance. Stone paths wound between flower beds, and a large purple wisteria created a natural canopy over the improvised altar. In the main house, Meline prepared with Sophie and her other close friends. She had chosen a dress that was completely her, not traditional white, but a soft sky blue that recalled the dawn sky. It was simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery that shimmered in the light. "You're beautiful," Sophie said, tears in her eyes. "And so happy." "I've never been like this," Meline admitted, looking at her reflection. "Henry, he saved me from myself, showed me it was safe to love again." "You saved him too," Sophie pointed out. "I've known Henry for years, and I never saw him truly live until he met you." On the other side of the mansion, Henry was with David and a small group of close friends. He adjusted his tie nervously for the 5th time, and David finally swatted his hand away. "Stop. You're perfect." "What if she changes her mind?" Henry said suddenly, and the fear in his voice was genuine. "She won't. You've seen the way she looks at you, man. That woman loves you more than anything in this world." Henry took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right. I know you are. It's just that it seems too good to be true." "Sometimes the best things are true precisely because they seem impossible," David said, putting his hand on his friend's shoulder. "Now let's go. Your bride is waiting." The ceremony began to the sound of a string quartet playing softly. The guests, only 30 carefully chosen people, sat in rustic wooden chairs decorated with wild flowers. Henry waited at the altar, and when the music changed and everyone stood, his heart simply stopped. Meline appeared at the end of the path, holding her father's arm, and she was indescribable. The sky-blue dress floated softly around her, her hair was loose with small flowers intertwined, and she carried a simple bouquet of field flowers. But it was her smile, that radiant smile, full of joy and love and certainty, that really took his breath away. When she finally reached the altar and her father placed her hand in Henry's, the whole world disappeared. There were only the two of them. "Hi," she whispered, and her eyes shone with happy tears. "Hi," he replied, his voice choked. There are no words." The ceremony was short but meaningful. They had written their own vows, and when the time came, Meline went first. "Henry," she began, her hands trembling slightly in his, "I thought I knew what love was. Thought I had experienced it before, but then you walked into my life and showed me I had no idea. You taught me that love isn't about changing who you are to please someone. It's about being seen completely, all the beautiful parts and all the broken parts, and being loved even more because of it." Tears flowed freely down her face. "You made me believe again in love, in myself, in futures I had given up dreaming about. And I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life showing you how grateful I am. Loving you, with every part of who I am, building dreams by your side, being your home as you are mine. Henry was crying openly now, without any shame. He wiped his eyes and began his own vows. Malene, I spent 35 years building structures but avoiding building a life. I was good at concrete and steel, but terrible at human connections. And then you showed up beautiful, brilliant, completely terrifying, and demolished every wall I had built around myself. He laughed through the tears. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. That feeling deeply isn't dangerous, it's what makes us human. And you showed me what it means to truly love someone, not the idea of them, but who they really are, with all the imperfections and all the beauty. Henry squeezed her hands. I promise to be your partner in everything, in joys and difficulties, in dreams and fears. I promise to see you, hear you, support you. I promise to build a life with you that's as beautiful as the spaces you create. And I promise to love you completely, fiercely, eternally. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests when the officiant finally said the words everyone was waiting for. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Henry pulled Malene into his arms and kissed her deeply, and the applause and shouts of joy from the guests wrapped around them like a warm wave. When they finally separated, both were laughing and crying at the same time. I would recognize you even among 1,000 lifetimes, Henry whispered against her lips. And I would always choose you, Malene replied, sealing the promise with another kiss. The reception was intimate and joyful, homemade food, wine flowing freely, live music, and dancing under the stars. Henry and Malene opened the dance floor, moving together with the same natural synchronicity they had discovered in that first dance at Sophie and David's wedding. Happy? Henry asked, spinning her gently. More than I knew was possible, Malene replied, resting her head on his shoulder. And you? Complete, he said simply. For the first time in my life. Completely complete. As they danced under the fairy lights hanging from the trees, surrounded by people they loved on the property that would soon become their shared legacy, both knew they had found something rare and precious, not just love, but the kind of love that transforms, that heals, that builds futures where before there were only empty walls. The kind of love that's worth every moment of fear, every risk, every vulnerability. The kind of love that lasts forever. Months later, at the official opening of the Callahan Wright Arts and Design Center, Henry and Malene stood hand in hand watching young artists explore the newly restored studios. Designers examined the galleries full of possibilities, and children ran through the garden that now bloomed with life. The forgotten mansion had been transformed into something alive, vibrant, meaningful, just like them. We did it, Malene whispered, her head resting on his shoulder. We did it, Henry agreed, kissing the top of her head. And as the sun set over the property, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, two hearts that had been alone for so long finally rested complete, loved, at home. Together, they had built more than a building. They had built a life, and it was absolutely perfect. Henry and Malene proved that true love doesn't happen despite our scars. It happens because of them. Because when two broken souls meet and decide to heal together, they build something stronger than any concrete structure or perfect design. They learn that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the greatest courage. That loving again after pain is the most revolutionary act of all. And that sometimes the right person arrives at the exact moment where final